All right, let's continue. Uh, there's one more major source of law I'd like to talk about really briefly, and that is international law. And international law is really unique, but also very important for so many different reasons. Think about the International Whaling Convention, which I've included in this module, right? We want to protect whales, we want to protect their habitats. But the problem is that whales, right, their habitat are entire oceans, right? And oceans span different national jurisdictions. So we're not going to be able to protect whales with, state law or federal law. We may need an international treaty in order to get the cooperation that's necessary. Now, I don't expect you to know really anything specific about the International Whaling Convention for this course. I just want to give you an example of international law that has some relation to wildlife, since we're using tiger law to explore the legal and ethical environments of business. I did want to say this though, and international law is really unique. Oh, and by the way, I've included a law review article written by, actually she was a student at the time, Adrienne Ruffle, on improving and strengthening the International Whaling Convention. You'll see that there are a couple of loopholes. Although the International Whaling Convention and the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, which is supposed to enforce the treaty, is supposed to ban commercial fishing of whales. The treaty and the way it's been interpreted by the IWC, it does allow scientific research whaling expeditions, and also whaling by Aboriginal or Native tribes. So there are a couple of exceptions, and those have been exploited from time to time. And so there's, how can we close these loopholes? But you really don't need to go into all that detail for the course. What I do want to tell you, share with you about, is just the idea of international law generally, right? It's really unique because there's no real international government. I mean, we have the United Nations, right? But the law, the resolutions enacted by the General Assembly, even the resolutions enacted by the Security Council, in which 5 nations, People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, United States, Great Britain, and France, all have vetoes. Even if you can get something through the Security Council, or you get the Assembly to enact a general resolution, it's not really binding, right? Each state has to decide whether it's going to comply or whether to comply. And the same is really true of international treaties, right? United States, for example, joined the IWC in 1948, so it's been a long-standing, one of the original members of the Whaling Commission, a big proponent. In fact, the International Whaling Treaty Convention was signed in Washington, D.C. in 1946, 2 years before the U.S. joined. But what if the United States had not joined the Whaling Commission or ratified the treaty? Right? It's not going to be bound by the terms of the treaty. And so it's really interesting, and this is sort of what I want to emphasize here. With state and federal law, you really can't pick and choose, right? You have to comply with the law or else face the consequences. Now, it's possible that you break a law, you're speeding, and you don't get pulled over, right? Or you break a law, your case is referred to the district attorney's office, and the DA decides not to bring, charges, using his or her prosecutorial discretion. That's fine, but the point is that you could be charged. You can't pick and choose which state and federal laws you want to comply with. With international law, it's a little bit different in that, right? Nation states, governments decide which of these treaties, which of these conventions they want to comply with. And there is something, I should say, known as sort of public international law or general international law norms that are supposed to apply regardless. This idea of, for example, prisoners of war, even without a Geneva Convention, for example, you have to treat people, even in combat, humanely once they're captured in the battlefield. This big issue with Guantanamo Bay and the U.S. military facilities there. But, if a member state wants to interpret international rules its own way, or simply doesn't want to ratify a convention or a treaty, right? It has that freedom to do so as well. So it makes it, international law is very unique in that there's that level of voluntariness there, that it's nations decide whether to accept international treaty or international law and how much they're going to comply with it. So granted, public opinion can put pressure on governments to comply with international norms, etc. I mentioned this because right now, and I've included it in the modules, there is a proposed convention, a proposed treaty for the protection of wildlife. And I know many of you in the class might be, in fact, very supportive of this treaty. But you have to ask yourself, right, just because you enact the treaty, even get it ratified, let's say by the United States Senate, so it becomes part of our federal domestic law, doesn't mean we get automatic compliance, right? We have the issue of who can sue under the treaty to enforce its provisions, and we have the initial issue of whether a government is going to ratify the treaty in the first place. But that said, international law is actually a very important part of the legal environment because a lot of business transactions actually spill across international borders. And we need to have oftentimes international norms and public rules to decide, what happens if there's a dispute between two business firms or two individuals in different countries. Usually we just go directly to the contract that the parties have signed. We'll look at the common law and the law of contract in the next module. But oftentimes, if there is no contract, let's say in writing, or there's a gap in the contract or an ambiguity in the contract, we go to international law. And that's why, believe it or not, international law is actually a very important part of business law. Not just for the protection of whales or wildlife generally, but a lot of business transactions that go across that go across international borders. All right, with this, there's, believe it or not, one more source of law I'd like to talk about. I mean, we've talked about state law, we've talked about federal law, and now international law. Have you noticed that in each one of these sub-modules, we've talked about courts? Wilkerson versus Florida, how the state Supreme Court of Florida had to interpret whether the animal cruelty law of our state was vague or not. We saw Lujan versus Defenders of Wildlife, a federal case determining, right, when can a private party sue the government to make the government comply with its own laws. And even international law, there's international tribunals like the one in The Hague. I myself, a few years ago, got to attend a hearing at the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia when Slobodan Milosevic was put on trial. And that was really a highlight of my legal career to be able to attend that hearing. And so the International Whaling Commission has its procedures as well. So you have to have courts, and you have to have tribunals, you have to have judges, you have to have entities to interpret the meaning, to interpret the meaning of the laws. I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll look at then one last case where this became a big issue. Is a fish a tangible object?